Troy Anthony Davis. This man is about to be executed. For 20 years on death row in a Georgia prison, 7 of the 9 witnesses who incriminated him suddenly say they lied. So if he wasn't the murderer who fired the gun on that fateful night, this case shook the world, prompting Pope Benedict XVI, former U.S. President Jimmy Carter, and Archbishop Desmond Tutu to speak out. Nearly 1 million people signed a petition for clemency, hoping to save a life they believed was innocent. Today, we will revisit the case file of Troy Anthony Davis. We will explore the story from the moment he was accused of a terrible crime through his arduous journey of appeals, the last meals he chose, his final moments in prison, and the haunting words he left behind. On the night of August 19, 1989, in the city of Savannah, Georgia, a series of violent events unfolded that would change many lives forever. It all began at a pool party where Troy Davis was present. As he left with a friend, a shootout occurred between 2 groups of teenagers, leaving a young man named Michael Cooper wounded in the jaw. Davis and his friend then went to a nearby pool hall, not long after they moved to the parking lot of a Burger King restaurant. There, a man named Sylvester "Red" Coles was in a heated argument with a homeless man, Larry Young, over alcohol. The argument quickly escalated to violence when Young was struck in the head with a pistol. At about 1:15 a.m., police officer Mark McPhail, who was off duty and working as a security guard at the Burger King, bravely intervened to protect Larry Young. As he approached, 2 shots rang out. 1 bullet struck his heart, the other his face. Officer McPhail collapsed on the spot without ever having drawn his own weapon. Witnesses agreed that the shooter was a man in a white shirt. The very next day, Sylvester "Red" Coles, the man who had been arguing with the assault victim, went to the police station and identified Troy Davis as the one who attacked Young and shot and killed Officer McPhail. Remember this name, Sylvester "Red" Coles, as it will become the center of all controversy for the next 2 decades. A crucial detail: the murder weapon, a .38 caliber pistol, was never found. Coles himself admitted to owning a similar gun, but later told police he had lost it before it could be tested. The disappearance of this critical piece of evidence left a gaping hole in the case, a hole that would never be filled. To understand the tragedy of this case, we need to look at the 2 men on opposite ends of the gun that night. The victim, Mark Allen McPhail, was only 27 years old. He was the son of an Army colonel, a husband and a father to 2 young children, a 2-year-old daughter and an infant son. After 6 years of service as an Army Ranger, he joined the Savannah Police Department. He was known as a dedicated officer who sacrificed his life to protect a stranger. His funeral was attended by hundreds, a testament to the immense loss felt by the community and law enforcement. On the other side was Troy Davis, then 20 years old, the eldest child in a middle-class African-American family. He had once dropped out of high school to drive his disabled sister to her rehabilitation appointments, an act that showed his care for his family. Although he had the nickname Raw, neighbors described him as a straight-up fellow who acted as a big brother to children in the neighborhood. He had coached for the Savannah Police Athletic League and had signed up to join the United States Marine Corps. His life, though at times unsteady, seemed to be heading toward a purposeful future. 2 lives, one a symbol of law and order, the other a young man finding his way, collided in a moment of violence in a Burger King parking lot, creating a tragedy that would span 22 years. Looking into Troy Davis's past, psychological analysts would see a complex picture. He had a minor conviction in July 1988 for carrying a concealed weapon for which he was fined $250. This showed he was not a total stranger to firearms. His work at a factory was also unstable, suggesting a certain lack of discipline. However, actions like caring for his sister and coaching painted a completely different picture. The contradiction between the nickname Rough as Hell and the neighbor's description of him as a straight-up fellow is a warning sign that psychological experts often note. It suggests there might have been two sides to Troy Davis, or perhaps he was simply misunderstood. This case lacked a clear pattern of criminal escalation, making it more difficult to determine his psychological profile. Troy Davis's trial took place in August 1991. The prosecution constructed a tight narrative Davis had shot Michael Cooper, then gone to the Burger King parking lot, pistol-whipped Larry Young, and finally murdered Officer MacPhail. They presented 35 witnesses. Among them, 9 directly testified to seeing Davis shoot MacPhail. These testimonies, especially that of Sylvester "Red" Coles, were a fatal blow. Coles testified that it was Davis who had hit Young with a pistol and then shot the officer. 2 other witnesses, Jeffrey Sapp and Kevin McQueen, testified that Davis had confessed the murder to them. A ballistics expert also concluded that the bullet that killed MacPhail could have been fired from the same gun that wounded Cooper, although this conclusion was not definitive. The defense had only 6 witnesses. Troy Davis took the stand denying all charges. He testified that he saw Coles assault Young, but he panicked and fled the scene before any shots were fired. Therefore, he did not know who had shot Officer MacPhail. However, a crack appeared even during the trial. A prosecution witness, Darrell Collins, who had initially told police he saw Davis shoot, changed his testimony on the stand. He claimed police had threatened him with prison if he did not cooperate. This was the first sign that the testimonies might have been coerced, a detail that would become critically important later on. After less than 2 hours of deliberation, the jury found Troy Davis guilty on all counts. A few days later, he was sentenced to death. The initial police investigation, though described as meticulous and careful, contained controversial elements. The most significant was the search of Davis's home. Police found a pair of his shorts in a dryer. However, this evidence was later thrown out by the court. The judge ruled that Davis's mother did not freely and voluntarily grant the police the right to search her home, as she testified that they had threatened to break down her door. The police's failure to obtain a search warrant suggested haste and possibly pressure to quickly find a culprit in a police officer's murder. And so we return to Sylvester "Red" Coles. He was the first to point the finger at Davis. He also owned a gun of the same caliber as the murder weapon. He was also present at the scene and was the one who directly instigated the conflict with Larry Young. Yet somehow the investigation's focus quickly shifted entirely to Troy Davis, while Coles became the prosecution's star witness. This was a decisive turn that Davis's lawyers would later argue was a fatal mistake in the investigation. The death sentence marked the beginning of a 2-decade-long legal battle. Davis's lawyers continuously filed appeals. But the biggest turning point came after 1996, when 7 of the 9 key incriminating witnesses, one by one, changed or completely recanted their testimony. Dorothy Farrell stated in a 2000 affidavit that she felt pressured by police to identify Davis because she was on parole. Antoine Williams, another key witness, said he didn't know who shot MacPhail, and because he was illiterate, he couldn't read the police statements he signed in 1989. Darrell Collins claimed police had threatened to charge him as an accessory to the crime. More importantly, 3 new witnesses signed affidavits swearing that Sylvester "Red" Coles himself had confessed to them that he was the one who killed Officer MacPhail. However, the legal system has its own barriers. One of the biggest was the Anti-Terrorism and Effective Death Penalty Act of 1996. This law, passed after the Oklahoma City bombing, was intended to limit endless appeals from death row inmates by preventing them from presenting evidence they could have presented at their original trial. Critics argue that this law, though well-intentioned, inadvertently created a trap, making it nearly impossible for those who were wrongfully convicted to prove their innocence if they lacked the resources from the start. Court after court rejected Davis's appeals, ruling that the recanted testimonies were not credible. They argued that the original testimony given in court under oath was more valuable than statements made years later. By 2009, the case had captured the attention of the U.S. Supreme Court. In a rare decision, they ordered a federal court in Savannah to hold an evidentiary hearing to determine if new evidence clearly establishes Davis's innocence. The hearing took place in June 2010. The witnesses who had recanted their previous testimonies all testified. A new witness, Benjamin Gordon, testified that he was present that night and saw his uncle Sylvester Coles fire the gun. However, Davis's legal team made a critical strategic error. They did not subpoena Sylvester "Red" Coles to testify. This meant that the testimony accusing Coles was considered hearsay and could not be cross-examined. Judge William Moore harshly criticized this decision, stating that Coles was one of the most critical witnesses to Davis's defense. In August 2010, Judge Moore issued his ruling. He wrote, "While Mr. Davis's new evidence casts some additional minimal doubt on his conviction, it is largely smoke and mirrors." He concluded that Davis was not innocent. This ruling was a crushing blow, extinguishing nearly all remaining legal hope for Troy Davis. On September 7, 2011, the state of Georgia set Troy Davis's execution date, September 21st. The final battle began. On September 19th, the Georgia Board of Pardons and Paroles, with 3 of its 5 members new to the case, held a clemency hearing. The world held its breath. The next day, they announced their decision. Clemency was denied. On September 21st, 2011, Troy Davis's final 24 hours began with extreme tension. His lawyers filed emergency appeals to the Butts County Superior Court, then the Georgia Supreme Court. All were denied. The White House announced that President Obama would not intervene. Troy Davis refused a special last meal, an act often seen as a final assertion of innocence. He was to have the standard prison meal, but time was running out. The execution was scheduled for 7 p.m. But just as the hour approached, a flash of news broke. The U.S. Supreme Court announced it would review the final appeal. The execution was put on hold. In the death chamber outside the prison, where protesters had gathered, and around the world, hope was rekindled. Tense hours passed. At 10:20 p.m., the final verdict came down. The Supreme Court had denied the appeal. All legal avenues were exhausted. At 10:53 p.m., the lethal injection process began. Troy Davis was asked if he had any final words. With the McPhail family and his own family present, he looked towards the victim's family and spoke calmly. "Well, first of all, I'd like to address the McPhail family. I'd like to let you all know, despite the situation, I know all of you are still convinced that I'm the person that killed your father, your son, and your brother. But I am innocent. The incident that happened that night was not my fault. I did not have a gun that night. I did not shoot your family member. But I am so sorry for your loss. I really am, sincerely. All I can ask is that each of you look deeper into this case so that you really will finally see the truth. I ask my family and friends that you all continue to pray, that you all continue to forgive. Continue to fight this fight. For those about to take my life, may God have mercy on all of your souls. God bless you all." At 11:08 p.m. on September 21st, 2011, Troy Anthony Davis was pronounced dead. The death of Troy Davis did not close the case. Instead, it turned him into a symbol for the anti-death penalty movement and a painful reminder of the potential flaws within the justice system. For the McPhail family, the execution brought some peace. But for Davis's supporters, it was a miscarriage of justice. Martina Correa, his sister, who had fought tirelessly for her brother for 20 years, died of cancer shortly after his execution. The biggest questions remain. Who really killed Officer Mark McPhail? What was Sylvester "Red" Coles' role that night? And is the legal system, with its strict procedures and barriers, capable of correcting its own mistakes when a life is on the line? The Troy Davis case teaches us that truth is sometimes not something that can be found in a courtroom. It exists somewhere between the conflicting testimonies, the lost evidence, and in the final words of a man who took his truth with him to the grave.